It was the longest, largest, and most complex naval battle in history. It lasted for 2,074 days. It spanned millions of square miles of unforgiving, freezing ocean. This was the Battle of the Atlantic. For the United Kingdom, this was not just a theatre of war, it was a fight for survival. The island nation was hanging by a thread, a lifeline of merchant ships, bringing food, fuel, and steel from the Americas. If that line was cut, Britain would starve. It would freeze. It would surrender. And trying to cut that line were the grey wolves, the dreaded U-boats of the German Kriegsmarine. They hunted in packs, striking from the deep, turning the Atlantic into a graveyard of burning oil and sinking steel. In the early years of the war, the Allies were losing. They were blind. The ocean was too vast, the convoys too slow. There was a terrifying stretch of ocean known as the Black Pit, the mid-Atlantic gap, where land-based aircraft could not reach. In that gap, the U-boats were kings. They could surface, recharge their batteries, and pick off ships at their leisure. Britain needed a guardian. They needed a weapon that could bridge that gap. They did not need a fast fighter or a high-altitude bomber. They needed a beast of burden, a machine that could live in the sky and land on the sea. They needed the short Sunderland. To the Germans, it would become a monster, a prickly, unkillable beast. They called the Fliegen Stachelschwein the flying porcupine. But to the Royal Air Force and the terrified merchant sailors freezing in the water below, it was simply the bus, a savior with wings. But the story of this war machine does not begin with a request for weapons. It begins, strangely enough, with a demand for luxury. The early 1930s was the golden age of the flying boat. Runways were expensive and rare, but the water was everywhere. If you wanted to connect the far-flung corners of the British Empire from London to Singapore, from Sydney to Cape Town, you landed on the sea. The British Air Ministry looked with envy at the Americans and the Germans. The Sikorsky's 42 was dominating the Caribbean. The massive German Dornier Do X was stunning crowds in Europe. Britain had no equivalent. They were falling behind in the race for the skies. So in November 1933, a challenge was issued, specification R233. The military wanted a next-generation long-range reconnaissance aircraft. They wanted eyes over the ocean. The answer came from the Short brothers, aviation pioneers based in Belfast. They were already building the legendary S-23 Empire class, a civilian airliner designed for comfort and prestige. The logic was simple. If the S-23 could carry passengers in luxury across the globe, a militarized version could carry bombs and cameras across the Atlantic. The result was the S-25, the Sunderland. Named after a gritty port city in northeast England, the Sunderland was a masterpiece of adaptation. At first glance, it looked like its civilian cousin. It had the same deep hull, the same high-mounted wing. But the S-25 was bred for a harder life. The hull was refined, the aerodynamics sharpened to give the pilots better visibility when hunting for periscopes in the grey swell. This was a massive machine. It was powered by 4 Bristol Pegasus radial engines roaring with over 1,000 horsepower each. It had a wingspan of over 112 feet. It was designed to reach a top speed of 210 miles per hour. By modern standards, that sounds slow. But in 1938, for a boat that could fly carrying that much weight, it was a marvel of engineering. But the most remarkable thing about the Sunderland was not its speed, or even its guns, it was the inside. War is often described as long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. The short Sunderland was designed specifically for the boredom. Patrols in the Atlantic could last 13, sometimes 14 hours. You could not ask a crew to sit strapped in a cockpit for that long, freezing and starving, and expect them to be sharp enough to spot the tiny feather wake of a periscope. So the Short brothers built a flying hotel. The interior was split into 2 decks. On the lower deck, the war felt far away. There was a wardroom for the officers. There was a galley equipped with a pressure stove so crewmen could cook fresh meals, brewing endless pots of tea and frying bacon while cruising at 2,000 feet. There were 6 bunks for off-duty crew to sleep. There was even a fully equipped machine shop with a vise and tools, allowing the flight engineers to perform repairs on the aircraft while it was in the air. And perhaps the ultimate luxury for a military aircraft, a flushing porcelain toilet. The aircraft was initially intended for a crew of 7, but often carried 11 men or more. It was stable, heavy, and reassuring. The pilots even had an autopilot system allowing them to rest their eyes during the long transit to the patrol zones. It was civilized. It was comfortable. But make no mistake, this comfort had a purpose. A rested crew was a lethal crew, and they would need to be lethal. Hidden beneath the domestic comforts was a spine of steel. The Sunderland was approved on October 16, 1937. By June 1938, the first Royal Air Force squadrons were receiving their machines. They were fitted with an array of offensive and defensive teeth, aerial mines, bombs, depth charges designed to crush the pressure hulls of submarines, and machine guns turrets in the nose and tail ready to fend off enemy interceptors. The plane also carried the eyes of the future primitive but effective radar units and massive searchlights for night attacks. By September 1939, the storm broke. World War II had begun. The RAF Coastal Command had 40 Sunderlands ready to fight. At first the mission was lonely. The Sunderlands flew endless loops over empty seas. The boredom phase of the war was in full effect. Some crews flew for hundreds of hours without ever seeing the enemy. They watched the waves until their eyes played tricks on them. But the ocean is a cruel mistress, and the enemy was not the only threat. On September 21, 1939, just weeks into the war, the merchant ship Kensington Court was torpedoed in the North Sea. The crew was dumped into the freezing water. Death was minutes away. From the clouds, 2 Sunderlands descended. But they did not just drop rafts. In a daring display of the capabilities of the aircraft, the pilots set the massive flying boats down on the rough swell. They taxied through the debris, the propellers whipping up spray. One by one, they pulled the drowning men into the warmth of the fuselage. They saved the entire 34-man crew. It was a heroic start. But the flying hotel was about to be tested. The Germans had realized that this lumbering white whale was a threat, and they sent their hunters to bring it down. The days of rescue were ending. The days of the porcupine were about to begin. As the war dragged on, the British crews began to sharpen their claws. The comfortable flying hotel was about to undergo a transformation. The Royal Air Force realized that while the Sunderland was excellent for long patrols, it lacked the teeth required for the brutal reality of modern air combat. The initial designs were defensive, but the crews wanted more. They wanted to bite back. The engineers went to work. The nose turret was upgraded, replacing the single gun with 2 7.7mm machine guns. Tail turrets and dorsal turrets were added. Gun hatches were cut into the aft fuselage, allowing the crew to fire from the sides. The crews themselves often added extra machine guns wherever they could fit them, mounting them in the galley or squeezing them into the beam hatches. The aircraft was slowly becoming a fortress in the sky, bristling with barrels pointed in every direction. But the true test of these upgrades came on April 3, 1940, off the coast of Norway. It was a cold grey day. A single Sunderland was patrolling the lonely expanse of the North Sea, keeping a watchful eye on the convoys below. Suddenly, the radio operator picked up a terrifying signal. They were not alone. Out of the clouds dropped a formation of 6 German Junkers Ju-88 fighters. These were fast twin-engine killers designed specifically to hunt down heavy bombers and transport aircraft. The Sunderland was slow, lumbering, and alone. By all laws of aviation warfare, it was already dead. The German pilots must have thought it would be an easy kill, a bit of target practice before returning to base. They were wrong. The German fighters broke formation and dove for the kill, swarming the flying boat like angry wasps. But as they closed in, they were met with a wall of lead. The Sunderland pilot did not dive for the water to hide. He held his course steady, giving his gunners a stable platform. The interior of the flying boat erupted in noise, the smell of cordite filling the galley and the wardroom as the gunners tracked the fast-moving targets. One Ju-88 took a direct hit to its engine, smoke trailing from its wing as it spiraled down into the freezing ocean. Another German fighter was riddled with bullets, forced to break off and limp back to land. The remaining 4 fighters, realizing that this easy target was actually a death trap, decided they had had enough. They turned tail and fled, leaving the triumphant Sunderland to patrol the skies in peace. When the reports of this battle reached the German high command, they were stunned. They realized that attacking this machine was like trying to grab a handful of needles. From that day forward, the German pilots gave the aircraft a new name. They called it the Fliegende Stachelschwein, the flying porcupine. But while the dogfights in the air were legendary, the true purpose of the Sunderland was to fight the enemy below the waves. The Battle of the Atlantic was shifting. It was no longer just about survival. It was about hunting. On July 17, 1940, a Sunderland carried out its first unassisted attack against a German U-boat. It was a pivotal moment. The hunter became the hunted. The strategy was dangerous and required nerves of steel. The Sunderlands carried massive depth charges cylinders filled with high explosives designed to crush the pressure hull of a submarine. But to use them, the pilot had to fly incredibly low, sometimes just 50 feet above the crest of the waves. The crews spent hours staring at the ocean, looking for the telltale feather of white foam from a periscope or the dark silhouette of a hull just beneath the surface. When a U-boat was spotted, the alarm would sound. The casual atmosphere of the flying hotel would vanish instantly. Cookware was stowed, magazines were dropped, and men scrambled to battle stations. The pilot would push the throttle forward, roaring the 4 massive engines to full power. The goal was to catch the U-boat on the surface or just as it was diving. If they were too slow, the submarine would vanish into the safety of the deep. If they were too fast, they might overshoot. The Sunderland would swoop down, dropping a stick of depth charges in a line over the target. These charges were set to explode at a shallow depth, usually around 30 feet. The shockwaves would hammer the submarine, cracking steel pipes, blowing out valves, and plunging the German sailors into darkness and terror. However, these early weapons were not perfect. As more modern weapons were fitted into the flying boat, the aircraft became more effective, but also more dangerous to itself. In 1939, a 100-pound anti-submarine bomb was dropped from a Sunderland, hitting the British submarine Snapper in a friendly fire incident. While the bomb caused only slight damage to the sturdy British vessel, other reports surfaced of bombs bouncing off the water like skipping stones. In some terrifying cases, the bombs would skip up and hit the aircraft that had just launched them. In response, the ineffective weapons were replaced by Torpex-filled depth charges. These were designed to sink to a determined depth and explode afterward, eliminating the bounce-back effect and creating a massive shock wave that propagated through the water, crushing anything in its path. It is estimated that the Sunderland played a role in sinking as many as 26 German U-boats during the war. But the Germans were not a passive enemy. As the Sunderlands became more effective, the U-boat captains changed their tactics. They realized that diving took too long. A crash dive could take 30 seconds or more, an eternity, when a flying boat is bearing down on you at 200 miles per hour. So they stopped hiding. They decided to stand and fight. The Germans began refitting their submarines with heavy anti-aircraft guns. They mounted 37mm cannons and twin quad flak guns on the decks of their boats. Now, when a Sunderland pilot spotted a U-boat on the surface, he did not see a fleeing victim. He saw a warship ready to fire back. Imagine the scene. A massive white flying boat thundering in at wave-top height, its nose turret spitting fire, suppressing the gunners on the submarine deck. Tracers crisscrossing in the air. The German shells tearing through the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft. The British depth charges splashing into the water seconds before detonation. It was a game of chicken played with high explosives. And despite the danger, the Sunderland crews never flinched. They knew that every U-boat they sent to the bottom meant thousands of tons of supplies reaching Britain and thousands of lives saved. But even with their bravery and their new weapons, the Sunderland still had an Achilles heel. A weakness that no amount of guns could fix. The flying Porcupine was tough, and it was heavily armed, but it was not invincible. As it flew low over the waves to prevent attacks from below, the Sunderland was not an easy target, and its crews were able to defend themselves with impressive ease. Nevertheless, the most significant weakness of the type, in addition to its slow speed, was its range. While 2,980 miles sounds like a vast distance, the Atlantic Ocean is a mercilessly wide place. There was a zone in the center of the ocean known as the Mid-Atlantic Gap. This was the blind spot. The Sunderland sometimes operated outside the scope of Allied fighters that could protect them, and was thus vulnerable to enemy fighter attacks. In this lonely stretch of sea, if a Sunderland ran into trouble, there was no one coming to help. The aircraft also performed many successful evacuations during the chaotic German invasion of Crete in the spring of 1941. Packed with soldiers and refugees, the Sunderlands took off under heavy fire, ferrying desperate souls to safety. Back in the Atlantic, the war had entered a brutal final phase. Late in the conflict, the German U-boats were armed with heavy flak and had nothing to lose. The German captains would order their vessels to zigzag furiously on the surface, firing everything they had at the approaching aircraft. In response, the flying boats were fitted with 4 fixed forward-firing guns. While the Sunderland could suppress flak with its nose turret guns to an extent, the U-boat guns had an undeniably superior range, hitting power and accuracy. The confrontations became extremely dangerous for both parties, often with fatal results. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the Sunderland had cemented its legacy. The squadrons from the RAF Coastal Command continued to perform submarine patrols until June 3, 1945, ensuring that every last German wolf had surrendered. But peace brought a new problem. What do you do with a fleet of massive war-weary flying boats? The use of the Sunderland saw a steep decline in the post-war era. In a heartbreaking turn of events, many of the models built at Belfast were flown out to sea one last time. They were landed on the water stripped of useful equipment and simply scuttled, sent to the bottom of the ocean they had patrolled for so long, deemed useless in a world that was moving toward jet engines. However, history was not done with the Sunderland yet. In 1948, the Soviet Union blocked the Western Allies' access to the sectors of Berlin under Western control. The city was isolated, starving and freezing. The Allies responded with the Berlin Airlift, a massive operation to fly supplies into the besieged city. But Berlin had limited runways and the airspace was crowded. The British realized they had an ace up their sleeve. Berlin had lakes, specifically the Havel River. 10 Sunderlands were called back into action. These veterans of the submarine wars were stripped of their guns and loaded with sacks of salt and crates of food. They flew over Twin Sorties, landing on the river in the middle of the city, delivering life-saving supplies to the people of Berlin. The aircraft that had been built to destroy German submarines was now saving German citizens. Then, beginning in 1950, the world went to war again, this time in Korea. Several Sunderlands were deployed to the Far East, serving with the 88, 305 and 209 squadrons. Based at Iwakuni in southwest Japan, they flew grueling missions lasting up to 13 hours. They patrolled the coastlines looking for enemy shipping and gathering intelligence. These piston engine relics shared the sky with modern jet fighters, proving that there was still a place for the steady reliability of the flying boat. The RAF continued to use the Sunderland in a military capacity until 1959. The following year, the French Navy, which had acquired their models in 1943, retired the last remaining examples in military use within the Northern Hemisphere. However, there was still a need for it in the Far East, where largely developed runways were less prevalent. As such, the short Sunderland served with the Royal Air Force, Far East Air Force in Singapore until 1959, and with the Royal New Zealand Air Force No. 5 Squadron until 1967. Ultimately, a total of 749 short Sunderland models were built during its 10-year production run. It was a machine born from a civilian luxury liner that became a warrior by accident. It was the guardian of the convoys, the savior of drowning sailors, and the scourge of the U-boats. From the freezing gales of the North Atlantic to the tropical waters of the Pacific, the Sunderland left an indelible mark on history. It was slow, it was heavy, and it was loud. But for the men who flew it and the men it saved, it was the most beautiful plane in the sky. The Germans called it the flying porcupine. The British called it the bus. But history will simply remember it as the giant that helped win the war.